What's up, Movement Masters? It's Shawn, Myszka, Movement Master, and OptimizeMovement.com coming to you with another movement lesson. And today's a pretty important one. You know, if you've spent any time at all reading and researching principles, concepts, or issues of motor control, you've most definitely heard of a motor behavior scientist, and in my mind, a bona fide genius named Bernstein. One of Bernstein's most valuable contributions that shaped numerous theories across movement specialties that he had discovered that shed light on that he had referred to as the degrees of freedom problem. In today's movement lesson, we're going to take some time to elaborate upon and further explore the concept of Bernstein's degrees of freedom problem while highlighting some of the applicable ways that it could impact your own athlete's paths towards attaining sport movement mastery. Now, we know that how movement is controlled, coordinated, and emerges among the complex dynamical systems that is the human body within the environment is at the fundamental level of what needs to be understood if we're ever going to acquire the most masterful movement in sport. And really, in 1967, Bernstein was the first, at least the first known, to begin addressing and unfolding the activities that really the brain and the body undertake to coordinate the most proficient motor activity of all the movement subsystems in order to link them together and link the performance of movement actions in response to environmental problems. And Bernstein's degrees of freedom problem really stem from his idea on the acquisition of movement coordination, which he's kind of stated as the process of mastering redundant degrees of freedom of the moving organs. So the problem then is essentially answering and understanding how the organism or the athlete will employ and control or constrain the large number of the motor system's degrees of freedom during movement actions that then turn into sequenced motor patterns. And of course, these are some of the most fundamental ideas that the human movement system is presented with when it must organize the ever-changing conditions or environment of sport, or it must organize its movements rather in the ever-changing conditions or environment of sport. So Bernstein knew this, and he approached this problem and concerned himself with how those various subsystems and their various components, such as the limb segments or the joints and the muscles, are controlled during the often very complex tasks that human beings are presented with. So the idea or the term of the degrees of freedom has been used then to describe the numerous number of ways in which any unit in any system is capable of moving. And these units then could be those various subsystems that we talked about, the joints, the muscles, etc. And from there, in order to adequately even begin to understand any movement problem and its potential solutions, we must first consider how many joints need to move. Then we must look at how many different ways that joint can move in action. Then we must begin to think about how many muscle groups and what muscle groups will act in order to move that given joint. And before you know it, you should easily begin to immediately figure out that the number of degrees of freedom can increase rather drastically with the more complex the movement problem becomes, especially because we haven't even mentioned yet the exploration of how many more degrees of freedom will be added when we think about the potential movement strategies or technical movement execution options that the athlete might have in his or her own arsenal to potentially overcome that given movement problem. And here I would be thinking specifically on how attending to the control of the sensory system to attain the best perception of the changing environment would also contain numerous countless degrees of freedom. So all this acknowledgement is all fine and dandy, and once we become aware of its reality in all movement problems, it becomes readily apparent how pretty quickly the answer becomes complex with any movement solution. But what does it really mean to us then as movement professionals? What will we realize, or what should we realize because of it? And can we manipulate it, and should we attempt to control it? All of these are questions that become important for us to try and attempt and answer. And in my mind, the relevance of Bernstein's degrees of freedom problem really starts to be shown when we think about what else he told us about the solutions that the human movement system uses to bypass the degrees of freedom problem within the human domain. And he proposed that the athlete will initially form functional synergies to manage the large number of degrees of freedom that must be controlled by the human movement system to create not only effective, but also mechanically efficient movement solutions. Over time then, or through experience and then the subsequent motor learning that goes with that time, experience, and practice, the athlete will discover the most adequate coordination of the most correct muscle synergies to overcome the problem. And to help us all understand how the human movement system's degrees of freedom will reorganize over time as human beings and people adapt to changing environmental and task constraints, Carl Newell formulated a model in 1985 based off of Nikolai Bernstein's original thoughts on human movement control and coordination. And that was essentially a three-stage model. The first stage could be looked at as an assembly of a coordination pattern, the initial assembly of a coordination pattern. In this coordination pattern assembly was one that was suitably selected from the large number of available degrees of freedom. And both Bernstein as well as Newell would coin this a coordinative structure or a synergy, which was developed through oftentimes the freezing of some of those degrees of freedom to make the body's mechanical links in each one of its parts more rigid and thus easier to control for the movement by reducing the number of coordinative structures available. In moving on from stage 1 to stage 2, the athlete will then begin to gain control of those coordinative structures, that one that they acquired, and they will also at the same time start to begin to establish more use of those relationships that have already been established so that they can more easily be utilized in the performance environment. And during this more control-oriented stage here, the athlete will begin to explore those previously assembled coordinative structures and allow that degrees of freedom to be released from freezing. So over time and through practice, the biodynamic structure of the movement solution will become more solidified, yet ironically enough at the same time more flexible to be able to be used in the changing context of the environment. And Newell called this adaptive behavior metastability of the movement system, which that metastability is essentially a way for the human movement system to use each one of its constituent parts to adhere together to achieve the goals of the movement, while at the same time maintaining flexibility of their local operations. And then from stage 2 to stage 3, so in that final stage, the athlete now finally begins to truly optimize the control of the skill. And here now, the individual is able to truly exploit aspects of the performance environment and start to truly master one's body and the body's movements based on the overcoming of the typical problems found within one's sport environment. And here we would also then begin to see efficiency in both the strategies employed for movement as well as the biomechanics of movement to carry out those strategies. And it's important to note here that the individual athlete will also start to learn how to alter the various aspects of both kinetics and kinematics as well. So we kind of see that entire movement optimization model start to unfold for us throughout this process of attaining control and precision of the coordinative structures. And really, the reason why I said that this movement lesson is so all important is because Bernstein's insights on motor control and motor learning revolving around this degrees of freedom problem can be very helpful for us to better understand how athletes will acquire the most optimal movement skills for sport. And hopefully, all in all, it will make a little bit more sense to you now after this long-winded movement lesson. So for another movement lesson, this has been Shawn Myszka, Movement Master and OptimizeMovement.com. Till next time, I'll catch you guys on the flip side. And until then, let's continue to master the art of optimizing movement.